Hey everybody, it's Jenna. There's a lot that I love about Watchmen. Do I think it's a completely flawless book? No. And even its writer, Alan Moore, would be among the first to agree with me. Do I think it's the best comic to hand to new readers who are just now diving into the medium? Absolutely not, but I could make that argument for a lot of books. But as a postmodern superhero text, which has since become a weird little corner of canon and led to one of the best TV shows of the century, I have a soft spot for a lot of its details. And one of them is its use of the word nostalgia. Initially coined back in the 1600s as a way to articulate why Swiss soldiers were anxious about dying away from home, the idea of nostalgia has grown as we have. So many people have spent their lives trying to define it and psychoanalyze it and break it up into smaller trends. And honestly, even dipping my toe into all of those definitions for this video made me dizzy. But in its simplest form, nostalgia is a yearning for something that you can no longer have. Sometimes a place, but usually a different time. And that yearning impacting how you move about your present moment. In the world of Watchmen, nostalgia is that feeling, but it's also so much more. It's a fictional world that is deeply concerned with the past and present idea of a superhero, to the point where Moore originally wanted to use Archie's Mighty Crusaders or Charlton's Golden Age superheroes to tell the original story, a domino effect that would have completely changed the course of popular culture. As if to hammer its point home, nostalgia also appears as the name of a cosmetics line, manufactured by a mega corporation owned by the series' main antagonist, Adrian Veidt. Decades later, in HBO's Watchmen TV show, the brand name nostalgia returns as a controversial pharmaceutical drug which distills a curated collection of people's memories so they can relive them, with all of the negative side effects that would entail. Both of these forms of nostalgia function as pieces of world building, with billboards and advertisements dotting the background of their worlds. They also function as engines for the narrative. A corporate memo about nostalgia in the back matter of issue 10 makes it clear that Adrian is the villain of the piece, and the modern nostalgia becomes a framing device for one of the series' best episodes. And they function as an incredibly loaded double entendre, to the point where the smell of nostalgia is literally in the air during the original series. One of my favorite images in the entire book is when Laurie discovers the truth about her parents in issue 9, and proceeds to react by literally shattering her bottle of nostalgia perfume against Dr. Manhattan's glass castle. Does it add another extremely literal layer to the scene? Absolutely. But it also taps into something evocative in the way that a good comic can. We can understand to varying degrees the emotional catharsis that has led Laurie to this moment. We can also understand why the characters of Watchmen choose to engage with either version of nostalgia. They own a few products or dabble with the drug, regardless of their personal feelings towards Adrian or his successor, Lady True. That's because nostalgia is an incredibly human emotion. This video isn't me trying to say don't feel nostalgic, because we all do in some form or fashion. This video isn't even me complaining about how much of our pop culture is fixated on nostalgia. I do have my problems with it, but I also recognize that humans have always been like this about older art and culture to varying degrees. We just didn't have the massive echo chamber of the internet amplifying it all. I have found that in that echo chamber, people have very strong opinions. They argue that modern nostalgia is a curse that's going to lead to the decline of everything, or they defend the idea of coping with everything by sticking their heads in the sand and reliving things that they already know they like. Hell, some would even argue, incorrectly, that talking fondly about any old thing is nostalgic, which is basically what I do every single day of my life. This video is about the way we engage with the feeling of nostalgia. As fans, as an audience, because as I said in my recent video on gimmicks, there is an important distinction between the two, and as creators. It's about how nostalgia has become built into the text itself in ways that can be beautiful, lazy, or downright manipulative. In the words of one of my favorite Teen Titans Go jokes, nostalgia is not a substitute for an actual story. And I think that superhero stories on the page and on the screen are an interesting microcosm of all of it. Something that I will always love about our modern idea of a superhero, to the point of wanting to scream from the rooftops about it, is that a lot of it is an accident. For every character who was created out of a beautiful creative epiphany or a dramatic battle for credit, there were dozens of characters and concepts that were created just to meet the demand of their publishing schedules. And for a lot of creators in the golden and early silver age, earning a living was more important than making art that anyone seriously engaged with, especially amid the anti-comic sentiment of the 40s and 50s. According to writer, artist, editor, and publisher Carmine Infantino, who co-created a laundry list of characters who are now household names, quote, "We were doing these things and we'd be ashamed to even tell people we did them. As I said, that's the reason we did pseudonyms, for myself and the other guys did too. We didn't know day to day if there'd be work or not work, you know? We ate or didn't eat. It was a tough life. I think Superman and Batman were the only things that survived the time, but even they were hurt very badly. Comics weren't trying to create a modern mythology, but they became one anyway, and that will always be unbelievably beautiful to me. Part of that shift was due to a sort of changing of the guard, as the first generation of readers grew up and became the next generation of comic creators. As these creators told their new stories, they started acknowledging or referencing stories that they had voraciously read when they were kids. Older characters were rescued out of comics purgatory, past mantles or team names were brought back and repurposed, and some stories had to be retold or even reprinted in order for a new story to make sense. To an extent, that last one was a matter of accessibility, because there was a good chance that readers had either forgotten the older story or couldn't even access it in the first place, because it it had been out of print for years or even decades. But it does make it funny reading things today and seeing just how often stories had to recap the JSA disbanding or the JLA forming or Krypton exploding. Either way, it started to shift the scope of what superhero stories could be capable of. Instead of being written and read solely like impermanent episodic adventures, they were now being treated by both the creators and the audience as pieces of an ever-evolving fictional history. It added a sense of reverence to the act of reading a comic book, regardless of whether you were a young child or a middle-aged fan who had already been around for years. Did a reader have to remember, have already read, or have even lived through that era of history in order to feel something towards it? Not necessarily, if the story was compelling and well executed. And the comics of the Silver and Bronze Ages showed over and over and over again how to succeed on that front, while still reinventing what the medium could do along the way. You can argue that the same cycle of accidentally creating a mythology that could reference itself and make the audience feel nostalgic also happened within superhero adaptations. Occasionally, they were pieces of pop culture that not only felt like an event, but were successful enough to have their own sequels or spin-offs. But more often than not, they were a standalone serial or TV episode that you could easily miss, or brightly colored subgenres of an action movie or a teen drama. Some were lovingly crafted by creators who knew the source material inside and out. Some were made by creators who wanted to pretend that the source material didn't exist, and some were made by people who just had a job to do. Fans could love and appreciate any of them, but the projects weren't treating themselves as a sacred text that demanded audiences be invested, beyond a weekly episode or a movie every few years. I feel like that started to change around 2008, as one of the year's superhero movies introduced the modern concept of a cinematic universe, and the other won one of the biggest acting Oscars. Suddenly, the idea of what a superhero adaptation could be had changed, and could be compared to whatever came before or after it, with all of the reverence and nostalgia that ensues. The projects themselves seemed to embrace this too, even subconsciously, as they culminated a trilogy, or built out a phase of storytelling, or dared to reboot a character again. Even by 2014, I feel like any of the more overt cases of nostalgia made sense on a case-by-case basis. It structurally made sense for the young and old cast to meet in X-Men Days of Future Past, and the Flash TV show, bringing back actors from its 90s predecessor, was charming, regardless of whether or not it had anything to do with the crisis that was seemingly down the line. And those felt small, compared to all of the other ways that the quote-unquote genre was expanding at the time. And even when Endgame culminated the Infinity Saga with some incredibly specific references to Phase 1, they were weaved in with a sense of reverence that everyone could appreciate on some level, without having to derail what was actually moving forward on screen. But that relationship between the creator, the audience, and an acknowledgement of the past hasn't stayed the same. With the comics, as time went on and the medium grew and continued to reinvent itself, that reverence began to take a bunch of different shapes. It wasn't just being happy to see a certain character again, or developing a preference for a certain art style or genre or tone. For some fans, especially as they got older, it was wanting the reading experience to feel the same way that it did before, to the point of bemoaning anything that got in the way of that. In the words of comic writer and editor Denny O'Neil, who himself was responsible for some of those groundbreaking stories in the 70s and 80s, quote, "One time I was speaking at MIT, and afterward there was a reception, and I realized, boy, I am in a room with 20 of the smartest college students in the country, and because MIT was initiating a comic book program, they're knowledgeable. So I asked, we editors never really know what fans want. What do fans want? And one of them said, fans want you to recreate something that they loved from their childhood. And I thought that was a pretty accurate answer. It was a trick I learned from DC editor Julie Schwartz. Keep the essence of the character intact, and then let everything else evolve to serve as a kind of funhouse mirror of contemporary reality. But keep the core there. You can't change that. Even when you introduce new characters, you have to find a way to make it feel familiar." The Marvel side has often been associated with a much more cynical outlook on that, with a quote that is often misattributed to Stan Lee but has no concrete origin. Quote, "Readers don't want change, readers only want the illusion of change." To an extent, it is impossible to have this conversation without mentioning Superboy Prime. Created by Elliot Maggin and Kurt Swan in 1985's DC Comics Presents number 87, Prime added a whole new wrinkle to the untangling of canon that was going on in Crisis on Infinite Earths. Also named Clark Kent, he grew up as a normal boy on Earth Prime, the stand-in for our quote-unquote real world in the DC multiverse, and eventually grew into having the same powers and mantle as his fictional namesake. He joined the fight against the Anti-Monitor and then was neatly put away in a pocket dimension with Alexander Luthor and Earth 2 Superman and Lois Lane. Decades later, he was brought back in Infinite Crisis, and not just because seeing him again would make 80s fans nostalgic. He became a stand-in for the toxic fans themselves, spending his days fixating on the good memories in order to avoid the fact that his family had tragically died multiple times over, and that the fictional world that he gave everything to had changed over the past few decades. He became so mad that he literally punched a hole in reality and went on a tirade to remake the world to his liking. Along the way, the multiverse got massively messed up, a number of characters died, including the Superboy who he thought had stolen his thunder, and practically every major DC event or relaunch over the next decade seemed to deal with the push and pull between the old and new that he had introduced, often with him as a recurring character in it. It got to the point of him being a literal fanboy in a basement, rereading the comics he was nostalgic for and arguing about about anything new on the internet. Prime became an outlet for DC to be incredibly self-aware, as well as an unconventional villain for the combined might of the universe to fight. But there was also a real profound sadness to him, like it genuinely chokes me up a little bit. At a young age, he got put through a ringer of massive highs and lows that would probably emotionally stun any person, and then was stuck as the butt of the joke for years. And his evil tirade in the name of nostalgia wasn't entirely his own. His feelings were amplified and manipulated by Alexander, who had his own motivations for reality getting remade. Again, I know nostalgia isn't going anywhere, because it's something that all of us are going to feel at some point in our lives, but it's undeniable that there have been movies or shows or comics that treat their audience the way that Alexander treated Prime, weaponizing their feelings of nostalgia and getting kind of lazy with how they do it in the first place. If something is going to be brought back, it needs to be done with more depth than this delightful talkie-tawny cameo in Shazam number 17. It's not enough to just present a thing that is recognizable, a recognizable character or actor, an old time period, or the entirety of a beloved story, and expect the audience to either do the emotional heavy lifting for you or just completely shut off their brain and lose themselves in the familiarity. It's about presenting that thing with a sense of reverence and using whatever it is to accomplish something worthy of bringing it back in the first place. That accomplishment can be harnessing some sort of untapped potential, giving a character a long overdue solo story or a year one origin, reuniting pairings or teams who have been scattered to the wind for years, or bringing back an actor whose tenure in a role ended unceremoniously. And there have been some really great examples of this lately. With every passing day, Spider-Man No Way Home feels like a genuine miracle to me for how effortlessly it wove in Tobey and Andrew's characterizations and history and the excitement that everyone was going to feel from seeing them again, while still making them active, integral parts of the story at hand. Deadpool and Wolverine did a version of this well too, giving us a sort of island of misfit toys of actors who had slipped through the cracks of Marvel movie history, or in the case of Channing Tatum's Gambit, hadn't gotten to participate in that history to begin with, while still making the fact that they had one more fight in them a massive plot point. Even then, the idea of untapped potential can be a slippery slope, which people misinterpret as any story beat that wasn't shown in canon the first time around. There have been so many Marvel miniseries in recent years that are built around remembering when a character wore a certain costume or held a certain mantle decades prior, and the writing on the wall, especially after the first teaser trailer, is that Avengers Doomsday will deal with Steve Rogers returning the Infinity Stones during Avengers Endgame, which not only makes the inciting incidents of the multiverse saga even more scattered, but will probably take away the audience's ability to imagine what happened with that off screen. There are obviously some exceptions for untold stories that deserve being told, especially in year one origins or certain characters' first meetings. I think that the Batman the Night miniseries from a few years ago, which chronicled Bruce traveling the world and getting the training that he needed to become Batman, is one of the better examples of it lately, in part because its revelations also carried over into the DCU's present day. But a lot of these stories only seem to exist because they're set in a status quo that some of the audience might recognize, while also telling a story that doesn't have a lot of space to be impactful if the events of the present day have all but moved on from it. On that note, I feel like the other way to accomplish something that's worthy of intentional nostalgia is by meeting the present moment. It can be met by retelling or even retconning a familiar story in a modern context, which both DC and Marvel have succeeded at time and time again. And it can also be met by understanding how things have aesthetically changed since that original thing first debuted. I feel like X-Men 97 has been a particularly good example of this, because instead of just gratuitously continuing threads from decades ago, it is a technically impressive and anime-influenced soap opera that could have really only been made right now. And although the DCKO event is still ongoing as I'm making this video, it already feels like a breath of fresh air too. Sure, the concept of a massive battle royale to generate enough energy to fight Darkseid is just inherently cool on its own, especially once you fold in all of the wacky multiversal elements. But it's bringing the past and present of the DC universe to a head in a way that feels so different compared to previous events. The stakes and scope are massive, but there's still such a beautiful focus on the characters and their legacies, particularly in the different 1v1 fights chronicled in the All Fight Month one-shots. Through one small structural detail, that a fighter can transform into any past version of themselves before the next round, the stories are able to be nostalgic while still feeling incredibly prescient. It's not just about having reverence for how iconic Death in the Family is, or laughing at Phobo, or acknowledging how messy Captain Atom's Monarch era was. It's about tapping into how those events shaped those characters into the multifaceted people that they are today, all the while using art styles and storytelling gimmicks that feel distinctly of this current moment. And in the process, the event has brought back Prime, giving him a fresh start outside of the manipulation and mess that shaped him years ago. Sure, the toxic fandom culture that he represented in the 2000s is still going strong, but instead of just bringing him back as a mouthpiece for that, he gets to be a person who is dumped into this massive sandbox of narrative potential. And as DC solicits have already revealed, that will eventually lead to him taking up the mantle of Superman after Clark goes missing. And the fact that we have absolutely no idea where that's going to go is more than justifying bringing him back. There are a lot of things that inspired me to make this video. Over Christmas break, the comics I read and the movies I watched and the discourse over a streaming gaming show that I stopped watching years ago, all seem to be rooted in this idea of how to remind people of the old while still doing something new. But in a way, this video wouldn't exist without the month-long drip of teaser trailers for Doomsday. I find the rollout to be even more frustrating than I did in my gimmick video last month, and there's a weird sort of tonal inconsistency to the teasers and the order they've been released that I can't quite put my finger on. But more than anything, I keep going back to the ways that this movie is already pushing the idea of nostalgia. A storyline building to Secret Wars was always going to have some form of nostalgia. That is not my problem at all. And some of it is genuinely earned. Although the jokes persist about how many times we've had to already say goodbye to the X-Men cast, there is still some meat left on the bone for this movie to play with. I will admit, I have been particularly excited to see James Marsden's Cyclops. His name was the first in the chair livestream to really get a reaction out of me, and it is genuinely surreal that there is 4K footage of him in an incredibly comic-accurate costume, after the earlier movies were so ashamed of giving the team any color. And in a way, Cyclops' return is meeting the moment, after 97 and the Krakoa era have helped people realize how cool he actually is. It is absolutely a nostalgia play, but it's one that feels earned, and that throws him into a cast of characters that he never got to interact with before. And then there's the rest of that cast of characters, smaller groups of newer heroes that we've met over the past few years, and a handful of names who have been with the franchise for a while, with the marketing focus so far essentially being on the quote-unquote original trinity of Steve Rogers, Thor, and the characters who look like Robert Downey Jr. Like I said earlier with Steve and the Infinity Stones, the writing on the wall is that Doomsday is, in some ways, a direct sequel to Endgame. And in the vacuum of box office returns and just overall cultural dominance, that does make sense. But I just keep being worried that the movie will get there by dwelling way too much on nostalgia, whether or not that makes sense for the universe as a whole, and whether or not the audience organically feels it. There's a whole separate, never-ending debate about the dozens of characters who have been introduced since Endgame, who haven't really gotten a chance to interact with each other in any meaningful way, and a lot of whom will probably never be shown on screen again. You can argue until the cows come home that people didn't care about those characters anyway, so pivoting backwards makes sense, but the fact of the matter is, they're still there. The MCU is fundamentally not the same as it was in 2019, and it just feels bizarre for that fact and for the massive culminating event that's been teased for most of the past 6 years to potentially boil down to just reliving the glory days. On that note, we fundamentally are not the same people that we were in 2019. I personally cannot untangle all of the ways that these years have shaped me and how I engage with art and how I engage with the world. You can feel that way, or you can feel the complete opposite, to the point of wanting to use Doomsday's nostalgia as a refuge and a security blanket. But you can't ignore the fact that we've all changed, and you can't ask everyone who's going to buy a ticket to Doomsday to necessarily do the same. It's also just a little frustrating for the state of the genre, that potentially the biggest movie of the entire year is and isn't going to reflect the time that it's being released. I've felt that way ever since Marvel announced the theatrical re-release of Endgame, which will be happening in theaters in September. In so many ways, we can't recapture the feeling of watching that movie in theaters for the first time in 2019. I can feel nostalgic over that experience, but I can also recognize that it won't be recreated by sitting in a theater half a decade later with people hooting and hollering on cue, pretending like they don't know what's coming even though they already know the movie like the back of their hand. Marvel's teaser announcing the news was literally just a title card with the sound of audience reaction, which makes it seem like that's exactly what they want us to do, even if it doesn't feel the same. Nostalgia shouldn't be the default or something that is forced upon us. It should be one of the many emotions that can naturally come up while telling a good story. We probably wouldn't still be talking about superhero stories at all if they hadn't already succeeded on that front over and over and over again. The books that have made an impact and the characters who have become larger-than-life household names have used that sense of wonder and joy and possibility that's behind this constant chase for nostalgia to begin with, without having to be beholden to constantly recycling the past. In a way, Kamala Khan exemplifies so much of why I'm making this video. Outside of the Absolute Universe, her comic debut feels like the closest that the 21st century has gotten to the lightning round of excitement that Spider-Man brought in the 60s, while still presenting something that hadn't been done before. And it genuinely pains me that she's now basically become a vehicle for another generation's X-Men nostalgia. As former DC publisher Dan DiDio said in 2019, quote, "We do these facsimile editions where we reprint older issues of comics, including all the old ads and stuff. And in some cases, these are selling more than the new comics with these characters. People are more interested in buying these stories from 30 or 40 years ago than the contemporary stories, and that's a failure on us. We should be focused on moving things forward, always pushing the boundaries and finding new stories to tell. That's how we'll survive and grow this industry." He has a point. Art is going to evolve, and the audience is always going to evolve along with it. And superhero stories have such a rich, beautiful tapestry that it feels like a missed opportunity to not evolve too. In the words of Grant Morrison, quote, "Like the reassembling liquid robot Terminator, the superhero concept has endured and survived survive total disintegration. Now that we truly understood the engine and how it ran, there was nothing left to do but reconnect the pieces to make something faster and better. A new question would soon emerge. Was the superhero truly a man of tomorrow, a progressive image of futurity, or a nostalgic fantasy with nothing to offer beyond a sad, tired muscle show? They wrote that about the 2000s, but it still rings true today. And it is just fascinating to me to see how many different creators and franchises have a wildly different answer to that question. What do you think of nostalgia? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends if you haven't already done so. As always, you can find me on social media, especially on Threads at Hey It's Jenna Lynn. I would really appreciate it if you would follow me there if you haven't already done so. Merch is available at the link in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, go read some comics.